Welcome back to another episode of Becoming Rock Solid. I'm your host, Sean Harley, and today I have the privilege of speaking with an old friend of mine and somebody who is reshaping the future of farming in America and doing it right from the heart of the Midwest. Our guest, Graham Christensen, is a fifth-generation Nebraska farmer, regenerative agriculture advocate, clean energy educator, and founder of GC Resolve, an organization dedicated to making rural communities stronger, healthier, and more resilient. Graham has become one of the most respected voices in regenerative farming, not just because of what he teaches, but because of what he practices on his own land. He's helping farmers break free from chemical dependency, rebuild their soil, protect their water, and restore the health of the ecosystems that feed us all. What I love about Graham's work is that he bridges two worlds. He has the honest hands in the soil experience of a lifelong farmer and the bigger picture understanding of how our food system impacts the health of the everyday family in America. Today, we're diving into why regenerative farming is urgently needed, how soil health translates directly into human health, the dangers of chemicals like glyphosate and atrazine, and most importantly, what you can do to protect your family and support cleaner, more nutrient-dense food.
I keep it rocking like Primus. I'm way too turned up on a mission. Ain't no sitting in silence. Get to electrify the shot. Find the muscle you're hiding hard at the pressure. I bring the pressure to the bitch. I don't ride and see me live. Get it right. Free your mind. We got some living to do. We bring it big from a trauma, make them sick. You know he flexing when they ask you who you with. We gon' rep it for life. Rock solid, rock solid, rock solid. We becoming rock solid. Hey.
Graham, thanks for joining us today. Now, for those that don't know you yet, can you just share a little bit about your story and what inspired you as a fifth generational Nebraska farmer to pursue regenerative farming?
Sean, it's awesome to be on the podcast with you. I'm really excited to talk about regenerative ag and all the food and nutrition things. And so thanks for inviting me here. So my background is that I'm a fifth generation family farmer from Northeast Nebraska. And a lot of changes have happened since 1867 and the initial homesteading moment, for our family who were immigrants from Denmark who were actually had left the country because sugar plantations were pushing out the small farmers, ironically, and the King of Denmark had a favorite there and was moving more towards monarchy controlled, food system, and those pressures led my great grandpa to essentially leave Denmark and with the hopes to pursue an independent farming background. And so that influence from some of the things that he's written that we've uncovered over the years definitely has been a motivator to come back and farm as the fifth generation. So my brother and I, my brother's name is Max, we both ended out settling in and around the area and building businesses that would support, a smaller family farm as the systems continue to get bigger and bigger around us in the food system. And regenerative agriculture, as far as my lifetime goes, is a fairly new concept, although it's been around for much longer than I had realized it has. And it's been practiced, of course, back to antiquity, regenerative agriculture principles. There's a lot of knowledge stored within indigenous people, but my journey began as a youngster when my father had told me that maybe farming wasn't the pathway, and it was very confusing for me. So I went to school and got some other looked at some other focuses, but for some reason I was attracted to the land and the soil. I literally remember watching sunsets, like trying to figure out how I can be a part of this. And I moved to California. And I was only there for about 1 month, and I just felt that I was missing, my opportunity to care for the land. I just felt very connected, but my parents were farming in a way that, just really didn't whet my appetite very much. And I had that internally, that struggle, but I didn't know where I was going. Probably around the early 2000s, I started to understand how industrial monopolies were pumping emissions in the air, and I was learning about carbon sequestration techniques that could help more biodiverse farms reduce emissions or balance the ecological cycle, starting with emissions. But what I learned as I toured farms across Nebraska and the Midwest that were already practicing regenerative ag, although it wasn't widely being termed that back in the early 2000s, is that it's not just about carbon. Yes, the carbon cycle is extremely important, but when you start bringing life back into your system, when you start trying to focus on the recreation of living soils, that so many more things can happen. Yes, we can balance the rising emission issue potentially, but we're seeing water cycles come back. We're seeing animals, start to make their way back onto the land. We're seeing the soils, come back to life, and you're starting to see an ecology that potentially could more mimics the natural setting in Nebraska where we farm, and that's the prairie. And so all of this just continued to get me more excited. But there was family politics going on, and that I think held us back for years. But still, kitchen table compromises, those conversations with the family usually could find something new to try. Tried to really focus on programs that would diversify our risk as we tried, or I'd start trying small things, and all of those little experiments, just hook, line, and sinker. And I'm completely into trying to create living soils on the farm. And it's a learning experience always, but one every year I learn more from it, and I just feel a lot better now that we're practicing and implementing the regenerative principles on our farm.
Love that. Love that. That's amazing. And yeah, nothing new under the sun. Government chased your ancestors out for, running a small farm, made it difficult for them, and here we are today.
Very
Uh,
cyclical.
Yeah, yeah, and it's great that you're able to get back there and maybe change some of these practices and evolve the farm. I know some of the older generations, people get kind of stuck in their ways over decades of kind of doing something a certain way, and so sometimes it's good to get that new generation in there with some fresh ideas. Now, for a non-farmer audience, can you just explain a little bit about what is regenerative agriculture and maybe how it differs from conventional?
Yeah, so I guess one of my like frustrations out there that I want to try to clear up is that there's, okay, what's regenerative mean? There's people pitting organic versus regenerative, and of course, there's all kinds of people trying to greenwash regenerative that come from that, kind of monopolistic sector. But I think what is being more widely adopted amongst those practicing, and we're hoping that governments will use this to define as they develop more programs to support regenerative farmers, are the six principles. So in our farm, we try to implement the six principles, which gives us all kinds of on-roads. The first principle is you minimize tillage. So you try to move as close to no-till. Doesn't mean if you have a compacted area that's not growing things very well, you don't work the dirt a little bit in that area. But for the most part, like we're trying to replicate the prairie, and we're not trying to break up the ground and that living soil structure over and over again. So that's like dip your toe in the water, start on the pathway. Definitely not doesn't make you a regenerative farmer from no tilling, but it definitely like start is that first principle. And so trying to minimize tillage. The second is all year round, even in northern climates, we want to have living roots in the ground. And so, you think of like places like Nebraska or many of the middle interior of the country areas where there's a couple crops that are grown and maybe they're rotated. Sometimes it's just like one crop grown year after year and, being
Hmm.
supplemented up. But there's then winter comes, and a lot of the year the soil is bare and it starts to move around in the wind, and when the snow melts, and when it rains heavy. And so you want to have living roots taking into the ground. And on our farm we intercrop a lot of cover crop seeds into standing crops, so something's already growing by the time we harvest out another crop. And then those roots in the ground, they solidify the soil structure, and they help it from not eroding away essentially. The third principle is soil armor. So the easiest analogy for this is that just like when us humans go to bed at night, we pull a blanket over to keep warm. You're creating with those permanent roots in the ground more of a mat for the ground. The temperature controls it, keeps it cool during the summer, keeps it warmer, during the winter, and it allows more chance and opportunity for life to persist and come back in the spring. So we're creating a blanket with the soil armor that protects it and further, from the extreme temperatures, extreme weather conditions. The next one is with all that soil armor and those permanent roots, diversity is king. The more biodiversity you can incorporate to a system, you're just going to attract like more birds and bees and pollinators, different kinds of beneficial insects into your system. So you want to increase the diversity the more the better. And, we all have budgets that we run through in farm businesses, and we have to take that in accordance. You just can't go buy these awesome, expensive seeds all the time,
Sure.
and sprinkle it all over, thousands of acres or whatever. But you can go a long ways in that. And so whether it's a cover crop that goes from one species to two, or you're doing five species, and it's also about like implementing native species kind of like around the block in areas that are underutilized, and trying to find how we can reintegrate some of those. Okay, so that's the next one. The fifth principle is livestock integration. So if you on-farm fertility, like our farm being able to naturally fertilize it ourselves, that's our long-term goal, and we're not there yet. And part of the reason is because my brother and I weren't raised as cattlemen. We were raised in a rural culture, a farming culture, but like we never like handled the cattle ourselves. We sold all our cattle in the hard years when we were very, very young. I just barely, even remember them.
Mm,
But to create a condition which they can start to move through the land again, livestock in general, ruminant grazers that help fertilize that land is what helps you get to the on-farm fertility. And once again, this is the area that on our farm, we have the most room for improvement on our farm. And we're hoping that we are able to link up with a good grazer so we can start allowing more grazable opportunities through our system. The cover crops do it. I would like to see more markets develop around small grains so that we can have more opportunity to create cover crop grazing scenarios. And there's permanent pasture, of course, can be recreated as well. But the goal is just as even though we're in modern times in 2025, moving into 2026, and it seems like it's a pretty far, stretch for us to be able to return the bison the way they roamed the range back in the day
mm,
on all of our farms and ranches, we want to emulate that rotational cycle. Just like the hyenas, the giraffes, the elephants, and the animals of Africa move across that continent. It's the same thing with the bison, in North America. We want to create rotational cycles with all this biodiversity that we've created on our farm. And so that's the fifth principle, and that's the one that we're still working on implementing. We do graze some of our cover crops, but I would like to have more widespread and more dense grazing systems as I move forward in the second half of my life. And then the sixth principle is really important. And the sixth one is ecosystem context. And that means that, well, basically, like even just within the North American continent, California is way different than Nebraska, and New York's different than California, and the desert is different than North Dakota, and so what's supposed to like grow in your region actually? What makes sense for, your soils, for your climate, for the amount of precipitation that you get per year. And so respecting the context of your ecosystem and trying to do all the other five principles within that context are huge. And then in Regenerate Nebraska, which is a project that I've been working on Nebraska to try to flip our state to a regenerative cycle, we have had elder indigenous people that have weighed in from the inception of that program. And we've come to believe that we can't truly go about those six principles without the influence of monopolistic greenwashing for the benefits of profits for a few, without really respecting the indigenous wisdom part and looking back to past generations that had success, of course, starting with the indigenous people, who are the last people that were able to work in balance with the ecosystem and thrive until essentially, Europeans came over and kind of messed that up. And so we're looking at that wisdom and even the wisdom of our ancestors who were still practicing much more of the soil health principles through my grandpa and my great grandpa. And I told you about my great great grandpa, looking at some of those cycles and how we can re-implement those onto our farm. So that indigenous ancestral wisdom part, that holds it true. That means we're looking for a way that works in context with the whole ecosystem as we farm within it, not trying to re-engineer the ecosystem, which is the trend, that we're living in right now. That's, I think, led to a lot of problems.
fascinating. Love that. Bring it all back to nature.
Mhm.
And yeah, you have to get yourself a herd of bison over there, huh?
Well, I got a
Mhm.
buddy that has enough land, like we farm, just under 1,000 acres, and I don't even know if that's a healthy enough, like, span for the bison. So we'll probably focus on cows, but I got a friend that ranches in the Sandhills. His dad passed away recently. He's our age. You may have even met him. His name is Ben Gotchel, Clover Cove Ranch.
Oh, I've not been yet.
And he came back and returned to the ranch. He's known as a excellent regenerative grazer, amongst one of the most talented young grazers out there. And he came back and is working the bison and trying to also have work through a more ethical harvest of the bison, including more and more of the products of the bison to further replicate and becoming more efficient, like the indigenous people, were in their prime when they were harvesting
Mm-hmm.
bison. So there is definitely people out there doing it the right way, but we could use some more people following that kind of example.
Hmm. Good. Well, hopefully more people catch on. And speaking of that, why is regenerative farming so urgently needed right now? Like, what are you seeing in Nebraska and across the United States that just shows you that the current system just isn't working?
Mhm. Yeah, well, we're seeing ecological changes for sure. I mean, I can just test Bell Creek, which runs through our place, and, I can find contaminants in it that could impact aquatic species, let alone, humans and just living things in general. The National Resource Conservation Service of the United States Department of Agriculture, the Nebraska office, they say we lose 3 tons per acre of topsoil per year,
Oof.
like a farmable land, and the majority of Nebraska's farmed. They're like, that's
Yeah.
obviously like not a
Well,
sustainable like pathway.
yeah. And in
I
Nebraska there, those, sorry to interrupt,
That's okay.
most of the corn and bean fields, they're just a big dirt patch for a good section of the year.
Mhm.
And the wind blows across those plains and on these open fields, and everything gets dusty all around. And yeah, you can tell that it's losing a lot.
Yep, we have this year is another example. Corn is being impacted. It's becoming harder to raise consistent corn in our area. This year, there was a number of funguses that came through.
Mm.
Southern rust, which is not the first time it's been through this area, but very it's not very, you're usually not going to see that come this far north. And this was going all the way up to South Dakota from farmers I knew just through farmer networks telling me. It's usually, once again, just like it sounds, contained as a fungus to the south. There was a tar spot fungus that impacted a lot of folks out there, and we had some fungus in the corn that would allow some of our food grade crop this year, which goes into was white corn, non-GMO white corn for tortillas. We're going to have to dump that into like an ethanol basket as a backup because we got hit with a fungus from an insurgence of insects called earworms
Mm.
that leave behind the kind of this residue. And it's just a shocker. We've never had this happen. And so, this is just, I think, more symptoms of uniform systems, carrying disease, in widespread areas. And so I have big concerns, about that. I think agriculture is potentially altering the weather under its current form because we're just seeing more extremities of things. I think, people talk about climate change, whatever you want to talk about. I feel like agriculture has had a role in impacting with the weather cycles with less biodiverse systems, in place, less habitat, and maybe disruption of rain cycles, which some people that I respect, talk a lot more about that and have a lot more information on that, to share. I think Alan Savory is a guy that comes up that's like done studies around, returns of rain cycles when you have like when you recreate more biodiverse systems. Also, I feel like our culture is being impacted heavily. We don't always we get to some of these things that we're seeing and experiencing, but we don't talk about the culture. And you and I both grew up in rural Nebraska, and the dynamics there have changed. There's not very many young people that go back to rural areas anymore because there's not a lot of opportunity. And as the family farms have been eradicated, intentionally over time by monopolistic pressures, we've seen the farm systems get bigger and bigger and become more industrialized, and you've seen retail monopolies start to gobble up the feed sources, the trucking, and even the processing sectors. It used to be processing monopolies. Now retailers are even gobbling up the processors like Walmart and Costco, for example, who have what I considered amongst the largest industrial systems in the US, if not in the world, both for Walmart for beef cattle being developed now in Southwest Nebraska and for Costco with their 22 million chicken barn operation, 500 barns that surrounds the cities of Omaha and Lincoln. and discharges approximately, by Johns Hopkins University analysis, twice the amount of litter that the city of Omaha generates in human waste a day, which means we have to applicate that around the area as farm fertilizer. We don't put that on our fields because I know what they put through those systems.
Mm.
But that is applicated, and just like the University of Nebraska Med Center former director in one of the departments over there had told me, it's like eventually you saturate the land, and even though we have great geological layers that filter our water, our underground water in Nebraska that we typically pull from, you saturate and drip, 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 and now you have consistent contamination ongoing, and it takes a long time to get it out.
Oof.
And so these systems are putting pressure on us environmentally, but it's also making it tougher for family farms to be able to operate. So they're going by the wayside. That means that in return, the businesses on Main Street board up, unless they have a monopoly that comes in, and a meat packing, monopoly essentially, which you know a little bit about in Schuyler. And then young people do come back, and that's one promising side. But then on the other end, 15 years later, just like what Tyson is doing in Lexington with the largest beef slaughter plant, they shut it down. The community loses 3,000 people. They
Mm.
lose a lot of that young energy that was starting to create a new business front. And once again, Nebraska goes dry.
Oof.
That's the monopoly pressures we're facing. It's everything from socioeconomic to ecological.
All these problems: soil loss, chemical dependency, water contamination, corporate consolidation. Which problem would you say keeps you up the most at night?
I'd say right now, they all do, first of all. They all keep me up at night. But I'm really frustrated with the lack of movement on corporate consolidation for decades now.
Mm.
And for a long time, farmers have been trying to say that there's too many pressures. They're not able to make a fair buck. And they've been pushed into a system where they just have to kind of, a lot of times, in my opinion, go through motions. And so inputs are going up and up and up. And you're looking at fertilizers and chemicals on the average farm. Could take up to 30% of their budget that they made. And, everything else is, for the most, everybody's got a different style and different business plan, but a lot of those other costs in that last, like, 2/3 are fixed. They're more fixed anyway. And so, as have looked at our budget, over the last decade, I'm like, this one doesn't make sense. This one keeps going up. So as our prices have gone down in the marketplace as farmers, those input prices consistently go up.
Mm.
And that pattern, and especially when you hear corporate profits and exec bonus payments are at all-time highs, you can easily start to pinpoint a correlation together that shows that we're getting used, we're getting gouged.
Hmm.
And so, that's why more and more farmers, maybe some of you have followed the Arkansas farmers who have been followed a lot lately, are really the first in the nation to start speaking up. We need new markets that more meet the consumer demands. And we need to not research antitrust, which is exploring how we reinvigorate competition that monopolies have extrapolated just from themselves so we can't compete. And we actually want enforcement. There's books from the early 1900s, the Packers and Stockyards Act, for instance, rules in the books that are not being followed. The monopolies just, run right over them. And unfortunately, Congress hasn't done the job for us either, and really pursuing any kind of real protections for the family farmer. So we continue to, get obliterated, and that's why corporate
Mm.
consolidation is such a concern for me. But I'm such a clean water advocate, and I understand a lot of things that can contaminate water, but I think industrial agriculture is up there and is being overshadowed way too much in this whole conversation.
Hmm.
And the chemical who have now monopolized with pharmaceutical, Bayer-Monsanto is a perfect example. Those folks, they're making have been making a big buck, but they've been allowed to kind of, go forth and do whatever they want to do, and that's continued to put pressures out here too. But that monopolization into the chemical industry, you can continue to see that there's only a few more to kind of monopolize, and And it's like that in the meat packing sector with the kinds of seeds and traits that we can be able to purchase now,
Mm.
and the pharma chemical merger isn't just another example of how monopolies, no matter what party is out there. I don't see how you can't look historically and say both parties have allowed this to continue to happen at the farmer's behest, which has allowed for, I think, a more corrupted food system, and one that, the United States citizens and many across the globe who would get our exported foods are, probably suffering from.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And yeah, that point about pharmaceutical and these chemical companies joining up, getting you sick on one end and selling you the medicine on the other end. And we're going to get a little bit more into Bayer-Monsanto here in a minute. But first, we'll stick on this regenerative farming topic for just a little bit longer and just let the people know what are some of the practices that you're doing out there on your farm, and what kind of results have you been getting with those?
Yep. So I've deployed all of the six principles. This year we just are allowing about 25, 30 head of cattle to go out and start grazing in a grass system on corn stalks that we had harvested. So the cows will be making their way and roaming across that. I have done in the springtime about 5 cows the last few years. So this is a small increase, and it's a partnership with a neighbor that we've created. And we're trying to find more use of those cover crops, and of course, animal feed is a great source because it's essentially grass that they're just eating through, and that's good for the animals. We've also deployed cover cropping, and we apply that in a lot of ways. When I say cover cropping, I mean that we're practicing the permanent roots in the ground, the soil armor buildup, organic matter buildup as well. But so come September, the corn's all tall, the beans are out there kind of in their full maturity as well. We'll use drones, we use planes, and we'll just drop seed like right into those standing crops. And then when we harvest it out of the field, the seed grows up and recreates that kind of, that prairie and that soil armor, and gets those roots growing until they go dormant for the cold weather and come back up early in the spring.
Mm.
That's one of them. We also drill sometimes. We got an old 1970 drill, so I'll go out and do some of that. But it takes a long time with that small and old drill, and so I try to do as much by the air because I like getting that head start for greater growth. But drilling practice works in some places great, so we always leave a little bit to that. We buffer our waterways. So like we farm in hilly areas, and at the bottom of these hills, these valleys, there's streams, and so Bell Creek is the primary stream that's out there, and so we apply 30-foot buffers on every sides of prairie grasses, so that as that first line of erosion of the soil could be running down the hills, and we've been guilty. We've seen it in like past. Just you can look at our Google Earth maps and see where the erosion gullies are. Our goal has been to target where the water moves down those hills into the waterways and stop
Hmm.
it. So the first line of defense is the prairie buffer, and
Hmm.
it creates all kinds of opportunities for like roosting birds such as pheasants to come back into the area, which we've seen, which is really cool.
Nice.
Yeah, there's a lot of wildlife and birds that hang out down the area. There's pollinators down there, so the neighbor's got beehives, and I always spot his bees, down in that area as well. And so
Nice.
that's another thing. We eliminate the seed coats, so we don't put seed in the ground that has the neonicotinoid seed coatings that are being shown to have some role in bee colony collapse. We produce more of our energy on site from the sun with a smaller distributed solar system, at least as much as the utility will allow us to do. So we have our own energy production going on to about 65% of the farm as part of that, and we grow primarily non-genetically modified varieties of food grade grain, primarily corn and soybeans for marketplace. But we're actually got some kind of cool things coming up that we're hoping to shake up the rotation a little bit more. Traditionally, I had mentioned earlier, is white corn, and then we've done like edamame and tofu beans, and we're going to do some of that coming up this year. I'm still trying to match like what market I'm going to sell that to, so still trying to figure out specifically what I'm going to grow. And probably we're working on a gluten-free sorghum grain, which is a cereal grain, traditionally for livestock, but there's a waxy breed that we're looking at a market partnership in California with the company out there that is sourcing them to a label that's essentially selling cereal grains out there and wants to have a more healthy variety. And the other thing that we're doing that I got to mention as well is that a ton of native species research and just throwing seeds. We've had a big effort on kind of retreeing the area, so a lot of agroecology going on. For instance, we got a 100 orchard, hazelnut orchard we planted about 5 years ago that's just starting to produce nuts.
Oh,
And
cool.
yeah, that one's cool. And then we have done some big work on shelter belt restoration. Shelter belts, the homesteaders and some of the generations after built them around their places to protect us from the crazy winds in Nebraska as we lived in these
Mhm.
areas on the prairie. But around those shelter belts, we've added more spruce or yeah, specifically spruce trees and fir trees for further buffering protection of this old growth groves. And in between, we've added pecans and black cherries and another breed of cherries. And
Mm.
so that adds up to about 300 additional trees. And I'd say over the last 10 years, probably put in a couple thousand trees of different varieties. We've got
Wow.
pawpaws we've been planting, persimmons, and I could go over this list for a long time, but I'm really, really excited about integrating more species. And I don't always do native species, but I try to have my primary focus be on reinvigorating native species. And then
Mhm.
one other thing that I'm doing, I'm looking down in the ground and up in the trees instead of just like straight ahead and walking by things more, which
Yeah.
means that as like we've taken small little areas, like, just out of conventionalism or just neglecting, we've kind of been able to rewild. So I see things like prairie rose come back up or
Mm.
some native elderberries. And we find those patches and we kind of groom them up and we're just like plucking more of those little things off, for ourselves and also advocating for new markets, in Nebraska or just domestically across the U.S. that we can start as farmers being able to grow into. But I use a lot of this experimental and just for ourselves, and I pass it along to friends or maybe some nonprofits I like right
Mhm.
now because there are no markets developed for any of this stuff in the interior of the country, which is just
Mm.
another way that we're getting kind of stranglehold into only a few commodities. We're trying to do significant breakups of our rotation, but lack of markets is a big problem, and I also blame that on our anti-competitive environment.
Yeah, if you could, serve those products to the local people there of your state, then that would kind of solve that problem because, it's a really interesting way for farmers to just kind of diversify their portfolio, right? They're not just succumbing to the price of one commodity so much.
Yep.
Um, let's
And
talk about
domestically, Sean, that's the other thing. Just domestically, like
domestically. Yeah.
there's barely any domestic markets like
Hmm.
exist for like kind of that mid-tier farm like what we are or for any farm. I don't get to just like, I mean, I do this all the time, cold call, make new relations. I know people all over the country and beyond. And so like we talk about these things, but there's a very limited access to new product markets in the whole nation. So, as the export market is, fighting over tariffs and there's all this uncertainty here and we have an overglut of grain because of all this that's devalued, and there's been talk about domestic revamping the domestic marketplace so we can get food to people like you, in Florida and California. But why not Chicago and Denver, and Minneapolis and Kansas City and Omaha in our area too for starts? There's very little domestic markets, so we really are having trouble being able to get what I'm hearing consumers more and more demand out there as healthy products from the
Yeah.
U.S.
We'd rather import it from Argentina.
We do, and that's legit.
Exactly. Um, and then just real quick on soil health, because I feel like a lot of people don't really kind of grasp how important that is when it comes to the nutrient density of the food, even the flavor of the food, et cetera. So could you just explain a little bit about kind of how soil biology affects the quality of the food and then how kind of modern farming practices can damage that soil?
Yeah. Well, first, modern farming practices essentially burn life out of the soil, and they supplement them with more precision. Like you could compare it to like an injection of fertilizer, right next to the seed that it can be able to take up and grow, even though you have a crusty soil that lacks life. So, anhydrous, some fertilizers that farmers have used historically, such as anhydrous, burns life away, but it stimulates the growth quickly of that crop. So, that's the trade-off that we're doing is we're kind of killing everything around it in order to stimulate, plants, all these plants that are lined up in a row. There's definitely better pathways. And so focusing first on the health of the soil is number one, in my opinion. It all starts from there. That's where life starts. That's, that ultimately where we return, right? So is to the earth. And so we need to take care of that. We do a lot of soil testing on our farm to try to kind of establish some metrics. Typically, people start with the conversation of you want to have good organic matter, but then there's some areas of the country, just like the desert, that can improve organic matter, but that's can't be the all end all goal. So you want to have a living organic matter, and that means you want to have a bacterial and fungal ratio that starts appearing in the soil even as you're farming. You want to maintain that life in the soil because they're starting to do things that also are beneficial in creating like more natural fertilization. Also, we're looking at respiration rates of our soil, like how's it breathing? To me, the earth is. I look at this as the earth is living just like we are, and we're just like an extension of something that's alive.
Mm.
And the soil, like when I look at the soil and all its moving parts, like under a microscope, I start to see that.
Mhm.
And so we're looking at how the soil is actually respirating, and you can really easily look at that and tell if its soil's not doing very well versus if it is. And we've seen improvements after utilizing these practices in both the living organic matter, the respiratory rate, and as well as certainly the bacterial fungal ratios and more emergence to the living soil, which when I started this, we still had pretty good organic matter in our area, but it wasn't alive. So that's been the quest, is essentially pumping life back into our soil. And so it's very important to have a healthy biology of soil. And we use these tests to kind of mark like what how these practices are working and what we're stepping into. And just you can also kind of look at the birds, bees, and the bugs as another indicator as well, which we're seeing some diversity in species come back around there. That's positive too.
Nice, nice. Yeah, there was a study done, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago by now, and they were showing that there's a study out of a university in Texas, and they were showing at that time you would have to eat one orange then to get the same nutrition as eight oranges from the 1980s. And
Yeah.
that's how much the
Change.
nutrient uptake of the food has gone down due to the soil depletion. And we may be getting bigger crops, but they got less nutrition in them. They've got less color in them. They taste more bland. With that nutrient deficiency comes the taste. I don't know if you ever, maybe sometime you've bitten into a watermelon or something. You're like, okay, there's no flavor in this thing whatsoever.
There's a model where we're trying to work within the ecosystem, for what's kind of been given, what we're there to shepherd or steward. And then there's the engineers that are trying to re-engineer the ecosystem and trying to, solve our problems that way. And it just always percolates up new problems. So it's a real issue. And I would promote the non-GMO project as a place where you can get updates on all the new CRISPR gene edited and genetically modified products that are artificial, like I don't know, purple tomatoes and just stuff like that. Purple, just real random things that you see
Yeah.
out there that look like they would have all this flavorful juice, and it turns out that it was tampered with by this CRISPR technology.
Hmm.
And we're getting way out ahead of ourselves with the utilization of CRISPR to not only create new kinds of food products, but also to engineer new microbes that call into our soil and only have certain purposes, like trying to fix nitrogen on that one little seed in that one little spot where it was planted. So Pivot Bio is the latest of that's been pushed hard on the farmer. And lo and behold, behind the engineering and the development of that are Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. It's, really easy to track and research if you get down that rabbit hole sometime. And it's just, I feel like we've kind of become an experimental test grounds in order to quote unquote feed the world, when I feel like we're underutilizing the land under more diverse settings that could actually feed more people, and feed more people with real nutrition. And the analogy to that, to help people see it, is if I stand on a hill in my land and I look across and it's all one or two crops, it's just all corn as far as I can see. Well, I can turn around and I can, start to look in the other direction at our farm, and I could say, well, there's a whole field of corn, but now when that corn comes out, there's something else growing and cows come in. And I'm like, what if I took 10 feet out of that corn crop and just put a row of 10,000 trees like down the middle of that and started harvesting stuff up at, 10 and 20 feet high now, and virtually took out any corn crop that would dent, like, our overproduction, probably help our overproduction issues and actually raise the market right now. But you took that out and you just planted something that, right down the middle of those food. It wouldn't be super disruptive. You could have, on all these vacated farm lots, you could have gardens, you could have greenhouses, you could have these micro orchards, which basically don't exist in places like Nebraska right now, unless somebody's just, kind of real curious person like what I am. And so feed the world is something that the genetic engineers, created. Monsanto's, definitely a big hype monopoly, for feed the world systems. And it's all based on increasing genetics under the Norman Borlaug approach, which has only led to creating genetics for more tolerance of chemicals to deal with living species that are, essentially just trying to eat too. And so
Mhm.
that indirectly has created the health concerns that we're starting to see. So that is the two approaches, and that's a reason why we need to be very, very careful about what we're putting in our own bodies. Because if it's engineered, then we're experimental. Where this is the first time this has really happened. And what are the long-term impact? And even if there's not an impact with the actual fruit itself, what are they putting on it to make it work that it was engineered for? And that's the link that everybody
Mhm.
always forgets. And that's the link right there that actually causes the cancer, at least that there's more correlative evidence, and in my opinion, hardcore proof that's being dismissed.
100%, 100%. I think that's a lot of people. The main thing that, and it's the main thing that kind of woke me up to GMOs. And I think it's something that a lot of kind of, pro GMO people or people that just don't care, they miss, is that a lot of this genetic modifying is being done so that they can spray poison onto these plants that you're about to eat. And these poisons come with a lot of real documented health concerns. Glyphosate, for instance, one of the many things it does is it disrupts your gut microbiome. And your gut microbiome is like home to 90% of your immune system. There's also been studies showing that glyphosate, eating that on your food, will also result in low testosterone due to the gut microbiome being damaged. And what are some other kind of biological effects that you are aware of when it comes to these chemicals like glyphosate, astrazine, or maybe other ones that I don't even know about on the human body when they are contaminated into our food?
Yeah, I think the thing that's popping up, that also the University of Nebraska Med Center has a lot of new information on, is the great correlations along Nebraska's waterways to mega cancer clusters. I personally have noticed a lot of, like, the old timers in our areas that are farmers that were chemical applicators with the shakes. So Parkinson's or
Mm,
other neurological diseases like MS, of course, all that stuff is on the rise. And Dr. Stephanie Hartman in Nebraska, a practicing physician, she's been really doing a great job of laying over where we're applying the chemicals to the disease outbreaks that are coming, especially with certain types of cancer. So I
mm,
definitely recommend people check her out as well. I think Advocacy is Health is the name of her podcast. I hope I'm saying that right, but
okay.
they're talking about a bunch of those things. And then furthermore, the other one that people are not talking about is Nebraska's huge rate of respiratory illness. So we have respiratory illness that is higher than most other states as well.
Mm.
And, well, it's probably from the stuff that's floating around in the air or the soil carrying, various particles or the rapid industrialization and like the feather stuff, the pathogens that hide on monopolize chickens' feathers essentially, and they truck all over the state and they go flying around, or like that 150,000 head, beef cattle feedlot that's connected to Walmart down in Southwest Nebraska, in an extremely, low precipitation area. It's on the other side of the evapotranspiration line, so most of the rain that comes down actually goes up, or at least more of it does, and dusty, sandier soils. And so imagine how those things are kicking up every day in a drought year, and the wind rolls off the Rocky Mountains across those, those Colorado plains and just goes whoosh, takes
Mm.
all that stuff that's in the air that those cattle have been stomping around, and blows it across our whole state, across the country. And I'm like, in the mega scale of animals, you'll consider to see more respiratory illnesses. So
Mm.
I'm seeing a connection on the way we farm in general, primarily driven by chemicals, being correlated to sicknesses, neurological diseases, cancers, and then with the combination and also into respiratory illnesses, which shares some of the, I think, burden that we're bearing across the U.S. and respiratory illnesses in Nebraska with the massive growth of the mega animal confinement systems. So those are all very problematic. And then, of course, there's some of these that chemicals that drift as well, making it harder for us to raise healthy, purebred foods and fruits and trees and plants.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And some of these companies like Monsanto, they've got a long history of hurting the human population. And now that they're again just bought by Bayer, I got a little history here of Monsanto that I want to read off here. Just kind of some of the stuff they've done. This is far from complete. They've done many mergers and have bought many other businesses and have come out with many products. But just some of the highlights here. First of all, the name Monsanto, it comes from this family that were really into the slave trade that settled in the United States in the New Orleans area. And they had plantation in New Orleans. They had a plantation in Mississippi. They owned over 50 slaves themselves. And they were into the slave trade market, buying and selling slaves with the other plantations in the area. And the Monsanto company was then started by some guy that married one of the daughters of this Monsanto bloodline family. And he started it in 1901 in St. Louis, and they started with food additives. And then in the 1920s, they started making these PCBs, which were these highly toxic chemicals that were used in electronics. Those were making a lot of people sick, so those are now banned. They made the DDT in the 1940s for malaria. And I don't know if you've seen those old pictures of them just like spraying rows of children with this DDT.
Yeah.
And obviously that practice got banned too for hurting people. In the 1940s, they were also part of the Manhattan Project, developing the first nuclear bomb, which is pretty interesting too, that they got a hand in that, all kinds of destruction. In the 60s and 70s, they produced Agent Orange for the U.S. military to use in the Vietnam War and do what they called herbal warfare, where they would just spray this Agent Orange across forces, across villages, killing the vegetation there, killing the crops to kind of starve the people out, killing the vegetation so they wouldn't have cover for combat, and then obviously doing all kind of damage to the innocent people living there. And then 1970s, we've got, and that gave millions of people cancer, by the way. So it was giving cancer to veterans as well as the native population there. And then 1970s, when they first introduced the glyphosate, the Roundup. In the 1980s, they came out with the first genetically modified plant cell. And then 5 years later, in the later 80s, they started testing the first genetically modified crops. And then the 90s is when we really started seeing these crops pop up around Nebraska and stuff. That's when I was a farm hand back in my high school job working on a friend's farm. And, when we were growing up, it was, you're out there walking beans with a corn knife.
Yeah.
And a bean hook, and they'd hire the kids to just go walk these fields, and then all of a sudden in the 90s we started getting these just really clean fields that wouldn't grow a weed, and all the farmers were just really impressed and wanted to jump on board so they wouldn't have to worry with that anymore. And so in the 90s, Monsanto, they purchased DeKalb, they purchased Cargill's international seed business, they purchased Calgene, which was a GMO company in California. And then in 2005, they purchased Seminis, if I'm saying that right, but they were a leading global vegetable and fruit seed company. And so that made them the world's largest seed company at that point. And then in 2016, they sold to Bayer for 66 billion. Interesting number that we see pop up a lot. 2019, there were more than 42,000 plaintiffs who said glyphosate herbicides caused their cancer. And in 2020, Bayer pays out 9.6 billion to settle tens of thousands of claims alluding that Roundup caused their cancer. So pretty sketchy history. And Bayer themselves, they've been around for a while as well. They were actually the first ones to introduce heroin as a cough remedy back in the late 1800s. And so that's where we got that. Yeah. They were also involved in producing poison gas for Nazi concentration camps in the 1940s. Lovely. And in 2011, they paid $50 million for HIV contaminated blood products, these clotting agents that were used for these hemophiliacs, these people that had trouble clotting their blood. And so they had about 20,000 patients, many of who were children, contract HIV, and many of them died just from using their pharmaceutical product. So these companies got a long, kind of sketchy history of not looking out in the best interest for the people that are consuming their goods.
Yeah, that's so I didn't know all of that or a lot more. I didn't know a lot more of that than I expected. Even the things like that acquisition of DeKalb, another seed company, that was a competitor, is I find fascinating as they've kind of just gone around and gobbled stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
There's an author out there that I mentioned to you earlier, but Carrie Gillum, and she wrote a book called Whitewashed, which is all about. She was an investigative reporter turned whistleblower that was investigating Monsanto and a lot of this destruction they had done, particularly around glyphosate and how that was being correlated to the cancers, to the neurological diseases, going through the process and identifying how they were using people to capture essentially government officials by bribing them and paying them and just doing things like that. It's a pretty alarming analysis essentially of how they've gone about that, and furthermore that a bunch of Monsanto executives essentially get appointed to offices in places like Health and Human Services, historically and still are, that
Yeah.
are key decision makers and part of the reason why we can never get like any of these things regulated.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating book. It's a tough read because it kind of hurts inside when you read it, but everybody should be aware of this, and she does a great investigative job, and it's caused her family a little bit of trauma too, but I admire people who are willing to stick their neck out for all of
Mm.
us, and she's one of them.
Yeah, yeah. Just another rotating door between our government regulating agencies and the industries they're supposed to be regulating, right? Somebody
Yeah.
does, they get a good government job, they give Pfizer or somebody a few breaks, and then when their term's up at the government, they've got a nice cushy paycheck waiting for them over there.
Yeah, yeah, and there's nobody who's done a better job of that than, Monsanto historically.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Something else too, just like bringing up the gut microbiome, because I think it's like a fascinating field that's starting to reveal like more of a connection to our overall like health and well-being, as a healthy gut microbiome.
Yeah.
And so Laura and I, that's my about to be wife and also a colleague. We've had these common interests for a while, but we've been sitting in on some conversations that are starting to percolate up about nutritional dark matter and like starting to that's what is being termed, and that's like all the areas that there are different kinds of pieces implemented that have certain kinds of benefits. And I think the easiest way for me is to talk, when you talk about cannabis and you're looking at like the terpenes and different things like that. Well, as far as like nutrition goes, there's hundreds of them, and we know like a few of them. And so the chemical or the food engineering companies will engineer around those six, but there's all these other ones. So
Hmm.
when they're engineered with just the six and you put that in your body, you're missing like the 100 other ones that
Hmm.
also play some role that, humans haven't really scientifically identified what they do yet. But it's
Hmm.
incomplete. It's more of this engineered stuff that's incomplete of a full living structure, which always leaves us incomplete when we intake it. And I
Hmm.
think the research and the connection between healthy soil to healthy gut microbiome, and then what is in the nutritional dark matter and what does that do is going to help us better understand how to value nutrition better. So I think that's like a
Hmm.
hopeful like field of investigation and studies that's going on by some really smart people across the US. Now, on the other hand, the University of Nebraska Lincoln, when we approached this conversation with a couple of their departments, their approach is to try to genetically modify or gene edit new corn, soybean, and sorghum seeds so that when edible, that will improve your gut microbiome. Like and we told them we're like you can't just gene edit things or engineer things to be good for our gut microbiome. You
Yeah.
need the full cycle of the whole thing to go on, starting with the healthy soil if you're going to
Hmm.
get the max benefits out of this. And so it's interesting to see how those Monsantos of the world continue to have such influence on our collegiate and university educational systems, especially in land grant institutions like the University of Nebraska. So we're spending all this money trying to prop up another engineered seed that, can tolerate all these things, but supposed to help heal our, imbalanced gut microbiome when literally we could be eating pure foods again.
Yeah, taking us further away from nature rather than closer to nature with
We
the end
engineer it.
goal of like bringing us back to nature, which is a healthy microbiome.
Yeah.
That's
So
interesting. And just, again, I can't stress the importance enough of the gut microbiome too. 'Cause there's studies showing it's directly related to depression. And like I said, 80% of your immune system related to your testosterone. It does a ton. And you make a good point too about kind of these phytonutrients, polyphenols, and these other tiny nutrients that we find in food too. And one good example of that is if you're eating a healthy diet with some variety of fruits and vegetables in it, your body will produce its own GLP-1 hormone, and that is just a signal for your body to say, okay, one of your hunger signals is you're malnourished. Your body says, I need some vitamins, some minerals, I need some these nutrients in here for me to thrive and to be healthy. And so I'm going to give you a hunger signal so that you go out there and eat some food. Hopefully, I can get these nutrients. And so when you go out and you get that hunger signal, you go eat. Now, if you're eating just nutrient dead processed food, your body's not getting those nutrients it needs. So it's not shutting off that hunger signal. It's saying, keep eating, keep bringing. I still haven't got what I need yet. You got to bring more food in. When you go eat a healthy, nutritious meal that's packed with nutrients, your body produces that GLP-1 hormone itself. And the purpose of that is to shut off the appetite. Okay, I've got the nutrients I need. You can stop eating now. And that's one of the reasons why, to go eat 1,000 calories of chicken breast and broccoli is a lot harder than to eat 1,000 calories of drinking a Coca-Cola or something like that, right? Something that's just nutrient dead. And so, again, it's just kind of the pharmaceutical and chemical industries trying to kind of replace what they've already killed off in nature and doing it through more chemical means.
yeah, just more engineering and chemical tolerance. Another thing I would say about the genetics is, we're growing corn in like places where corn was never meant to grow. So it's being tolerated for more desertified conditions, which what do you need else to grow in desertified conditions? You tap the groundwater, you irrigate it, and you just dump a ton of fertilizer on it, which seeps through the sandy soils right back into the water. So you've created a toxic cycle with this genetic modification, not only for the chemicals, but for growing plants outside of that principal ecosystem context, where, like in the Sandhills, we've driven by some communities there that you're like, man, why are they growing corn like out in the middle of this area? And it's probably not a good idea. And things probably shouldn't be genetically modified for that exact purpose. But we could be able to diversify the food supply, create a lot of markets, get a lot more people out in the country, like producing a lot more things, and restore the middle class at the same time that's been taken away from our culture.
Mm. There you have it. Good stuff. And well, speaking of solutions, For somebody that's listening to us right now and they just want to start eating cleaner food and start avoiding some of these chemicals as much as they possible, and they want to try to keep their family healthy and raise kids that are healthy, where do they start?
Yeah, well, what I always say is that the best way to know is to know. And so you start to build relationships with those that are growing food. You take little steps, but know your farmer. The number one rule is to know your farmer as much as possible in your diet. Easiest way is to start, with your meat proteins if you choose to consume meat proteins, of course, but you start with your meat proteins and you start who's the guy that grass finishes cows and doesn't put, real bad chemicals all over it. Who's doing pastured pork or tree range chicken is a model they have up in Minnesota that I think's a really cool model to check.
Tree range?
Yeah, yeah. So it's not just free range. This is led by a Guatemalan guy, Reginaldo Hazlet Mariquin, Northfield, Minnesota, who's from Guatemala, and he said, and his point is that the native habitat of the chicken, because in places like Nebraska in the center of the U.S. we had prairie chickens, right? Like they're all chickens, but they're different
Mm.
species of chickens. So that would have been like the primary like dietary here, but he's like the heritage breeds of chicken are basically jungle creatures from the south. And in the early 1900s, it was an exotic dish if you got chicken. Like it was a real special like situation. And then we
Mhm.
figured out how to industrialize it and mass produce it eventually. And that was the first thing that went completely vertically integrated. But so in Minnesota, despite having a completely different climate than Guatemala, where this guy ended up farming when he immigrated to the U.S. a long time ago, they're growing tree range chickens. They're recreating a jungle atmosphere. It protects from the raptors above. It helps the birds just go through. They peck stuff. They eat the stuff that falls off. It creates a habitat for a living soil, including bugs in the ground that they can peck on. And then they use a lot of the byproducts both to create kind of like a soft like bedding environment for the birds, but also they have byproducts of like that are going back into the food source. Some are going back into human food sources like the hazelnuts. They're doing more things with elderberries, and they do all kinds of things like growing garlic in these systems and whatnot. But they're creating a really treescaped, biodiverse system that the birds love. And we go up there and we learn from these guys all the time. And there's a whole bunch of them. They have established an independent locker, and they're starting to get big enough where now they can actually move around their chicken a little bit. And man, it's excellent tasting as well. So
Bet.
my first thing, and I don't eat a lot of chicken anymore, even though I like it because most of it's coming from those Costco type, chicken barns, which are not ethical in a lot of ways, in my opinion. And I can't, I just don't want that in my body. So, red meat's overall the cleanest, but a grass finished product is obviously going to be healthier for you. Pig, okay, once in a while, but like you don't want anything that's been just laying around getting pumped with antibiotics and its own feces, like, all day, all night, never seeing the light of sun, another uniform species. You want diversified species that are more heritage breeds. And so you can start to make moves with eggs then, right? And then you start to understand where your markets are around your area. Maybe it's seasonal, that's okay. You supplement with those markets to be able to get more stuff. And if you got a porch, if you got a 10 by 10, square area of little land yourself, find stuff that kind of like adapts to your climate, your soil, just grow a little bit. You'll learn from that. You'll start eating some of that, and it may be small, but those little steps led me into growing all kinds of things like anywhere, and also like just seeing where patches are and that are, wild, and going and being able to kind of forage around some of that from time to time.
Mm.
So I think that's the next step, is that you're actually like trying to then fill your meat protein sources with as much fresh and local foods as you can through a number of different ways. And it gets time consuming, it gets tricky. But then I always say, like, our brains and our bodies are made of essentially what we eat. And yeah, there's other externalities where we can form that, but the most valuable thing that you have is what you're connected to, if we're not talking, in spiritual terms, it's essentially what you have here. And so I find ways to lose the sweets and save those dollars and put it back into this. I
Mm.
store things longer, I freeze things, and
Mhm.
then I eat this stuff all year round. And it makes a tremendous difference, I think, on how you act per day. And while, nobody can guarantee, oh, you're going to live a longer life this way or that way, but while you're living your life, you can get the most out of it.
Hmm.
That's what the power is. Because when if I have a bad back or something like that, I can't function as good. If my gut isn't healthy, it slows me down. I'm not
Oh yeah.
getting my full potential in life.
No,
So it's worth a little
vitality is
bit of
down.
it is. So it's worth a little bit of research and investment, and you just evolve with your body and with your food sources, and your network evolves over time. So don't be discouraged about trying to do it all at once or this is overwhelming. You do what you can and you build off of it. You continue to learn more about your body. You continue to learn about those who are going ethical. You continue to match make with those people, and you start to cut back more and more stuff that's coming from the supermarkets, which at this point in time, I try to only use them to supplement in the pieces that I can't get in those other ways. And we still have to do that. It's not a perfect world out here.
Mhm.
I'm on a farm. I still have to be able to do that. I got all the connections with who grows food ethically in Nebraska and really a lot of people across the country, but I still have to go supplement. And so I use the organic label to supplement and so I think you wanted to talk a little bit of that. This might segue into
A
some of
good
that.
segue into the next topic here of what can the
Yeah.
person do that maybe doesn't have access to a regenerative farmer or just doesn't have the time, et cetera, whatever excuse they have. What can
So,
they do at the grocery store to
yeah.
the cleanest food possible?
So you eliminate as much supermarket shopping as you can, but you're still going to supplement with it. So the gig on the organic label is certainly flawed. A lot of people have questions on, if it's true, and it's not perfect, but it's still probably the best label out there. And why I say this and why I'm convinced of this is because HRI Labs out of Fairfield, Iowa. I knew the scientist there. He had been conducting studies, collecting urine tests on those that were eating organic label versus those that weren't.
Mm.
And those that were not eating off the organic label, so they had a way higher amount of glyphosate in their pee. These are specifically glyphosate targeted tests. But
Hmm.
those who did the organic label, it wasn't that they didn't have glyphosate, but they barely had any. And
Hmm.
this was like uniform across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tests. And I had my family all take these urine tests too to kind of see where we were.
No,
And by nature, and you know me, but I really focus on a clean diet. And my urine test came with virtually no levels of glyphosate in it. And
nice.
that is in part, only in part, but in part due to supplementation of the organic label in my missing areas. Not reliance on the organic label because that would not be the best way to go, but supplementation with organic label because it is shown to minimize your exposure to those chemicals with what you eat and put in your body. But there's flaws with it. Like you can fertilize with Costco litter, and I don't understand how you can use an animal's litter like that to be your organic crop fertilizer, and claim you're organic. Like to me, that doesn't make sense because once again, I know how these birds are raised. This is for the rotisserie chicken specifically that I talk so much about with the Costco chicken, just so
Mm.
everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. But this is how they treat their rotisserie chickens. People use that waste on their organic farms, and I don't get that. That doesn't make sense. That's an example of a flaw of the organic label, but overall, you're essentially you're pissing less glyphosate when you eat
Yeah.
organic label, and so that's something to consider. And I look at non-GMO label if there's not a good organic label option around, and there's emerging labels that are trustworthy. Particularly probably the upper echelon label is the regenerative organic certification, ROC, which marries regenerative. It's like you're so diverse that you're finding an organic cycle on your farm. That's where I want to be as a farmer. That's where
Mm.
the best farmers, in my opinion, are. And
Mm.
there's only a handful of them that are ROC certified. But if you can find ROC certified, that's probably the cleanest. So look at your labels, but more than anything, and way more powerful than the label for yourself is to create relationships where transparency is okay. You can ask questions and make them long-term relationships when you find products you like, and just every chance you have a blessing to be able to grow something yourself, mess around with it because it really is a miracle of being a part of life on this planet that you can stick a seed in the ground and grow something that tastes good. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, like in our solar system, we haven't discovered a place like that. I know they're out there, but we haven't discovered that place. So it's rare at very least. And
Right.
to have a place that you can do a miracle like that. So it's a special thing, and your individual bodies and minds are special too. And I just want to see everybody, um, you know, get the most out of their life they can, because I know that that would lead to better political decisions and hopefully less turmoil and all these kind of things if we can, just get the most out of each one of our individual selves. And it starts with good nutrition.
Love that. Love that. And so if every family in the country were to just make one shift in how they buy food that you think might have a measurable effect on the whole system, what would you recommend?
Yeah. I would say that, first of all, once again, going back to the art of starting small, taking an easy step, not getting overwhelmed. If you haven't, go to your local farmers market. If it's seasonal, definitely check it out. Talk to those people, touch, taste, and feel the food, through that experience. That's because you kind of gotta sometimes reprogram your mind to understand like what fresh like stuff actually tastes, especially if you've been eating, more of the supermarket engineered stuff, because of cost differences or whatever. So start small. But then if you're into meat proteins, the easy thing is to get a friend, Sean, you and I, like we've done stuff like this in the past, and I have other friends. I just bought a pastured pork, with a pastured pig with one of my friends here. I'm
Mhm.
going with somebody, buy big, freeze, and learn to prepare, meats in different ways. And of course, you're gonna have your basics like a T-bone steak or a pork chop, that comes with it. But, learning how to like prepare things your other way. And then I
Mhm.
think if you're starting to pair those two together, you'll grow. You'll just
Mhm.
you'll just grow and take on to it, and you'll notice the feelings with your body, and it should
Mhm.
reflect on your health as well. And
100% it will.
yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. That's great advice. And we live in a kind of an interesting time in history here, as we just talked about, with all this consolidation of these corporate companies trying to take over the farms, and this lack of enthusiasm, or whatever you might want to call it, of younger generation kind of taking over family farms. But at the same time, we are in a little bit of a awakening and a little bit of a revival in just kind of the human spirit here going on right now, and people, I think, are starting to become more aware of some of these things that are broken in the system, and starting to search for better answers, more and getting closer to nature and taking care of their health more. And so, where do you see regenerative agriculture in the next 10 years? You feel like it's going to come back strong, or are we going to get snuffed out by the big companies?
I have big concerns about the power the big companies are wielding and the ability for them to confuse us as the consumer base, as a serious challenge. But on the ground with existing farmers, especially those that are 50 and under, are very willing to make changes. So that's promising, but they're getting gobbled up at the same time by the monopoly systems. And so that's the challenge. So to me, the greatest challenge right now, going on, is that as we're entering into this farm crisis, we're seeing more bankruptcies and farmer suicides and that whole deal. And the majority of the land in the United States, I'm just going to talk about that, is owned by the baby boomer generation. And the trend is they're selling to the highest bidder. The land's been inflated, and even existing family farm businesses can't afford to purchase it in many cases. There are exceptions, obviously, but the majority of the land is being turned over to investors. And there is some of it has is foreign multinational, based backing. There's religious groups, and there's all kinds of others, investors with big names that you would have heard of, and all our guests would have heard of as well, that are making a play on the land. I have concerns it goes into politics, and I have grave concerns that it jeopardizes that the national security of our nation by not having, essentially, those that live in our communities from the next generation have a chance to farm like all other generations in the US have had prior.
Mm.
Because if it doesn't happen, I don't see the six regenerative principles being implemented, especially with respect to ecosystem context. I see the big investors and their deep purse strings, using more of this land as test grounds for, gene editing, modification of foods, and all of those sorts of things. So ecologically, I think it's a problem, but I think it's a national security issue if we can't really harness our own land for our own food in the future. Um, Even though there is a groundswell of farmers that are existing that are really, really on their own shifting this without policy help or anything. And I'm a part of that group. Um, I think the most revolutionary thing that can happen in the nation is if there's a lot of we need good government back again, and there's a lot of conversations that we can go onto there.
Yeah, we
And
do.
there's a lot of bad investment that's a part of the government that could be reinvested into more beneficial parts. But I think like the most important thing is that we reinvest in the next generation. We give them business management skills and help them with an understanding of the six regenerative principles, and we start working with them to redevelop the regional and domestic marketplace of the US and firm up the security of our nation. Um, I don't think there's anything more powerful than that. People don't always think farming's cool, but it does have the chance to be the solution. But we got to have the creativity and the youthful energy out there again. And it might look a little bit different, than it did 150 years ago, but that's okay. We just need to really invest in the next generation of farmers. So that's something that is not being talked about at a high enough level, but I believe is pertinent to our security of being able to be functional with and holding stronger more of our own sovereign rights, which means being able to uplift our own communities without having a bad tariff or trade deal that blows up our lifestyles and our access to food and everything else. Um, so I don't know if I quite answered your question on that one, Sean. Maybe
Yeah.
you want to visit that a little bit, but I really wanted to bring up this point because it is all connected into that question.
Hmm.
And we got to get young people back on the land because it's just not available to them right now.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's what the biggest challenge is for us, in my opinion. Because if we had the right stewards of the land and that kind of creativity and energy back on the land with some guidance of the principles, it would be powerful, and we could
Yeah.
reinvigorate, cultures, communities, our health, and be more secure in crises type situations, which happen. We don't want them to, but they happen.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. And that being said, then what is like what's one policy that if you could just change it tomorrow would be your go-to, your top priority?
I would, so I mentioned antitrust regulation and enforcement,
Hmm.
but outside of that, since we talked about that, I would say the Farm Bill. And of course, the Farm Bill is like a 12 title Goliath piece of legislation, and I would like to do some reform in all titles, but the first title is the most important. It's the commodity title, and that's the program that primarily subsidizes six or a few additional crops: corn, soybean, cotton, rice, some of it's the big ones, wheat. That's primarily what our government subsidizes, and that's because it goes into cheap animal feed. And that's the simplicity. That's the simple part. And there's much more layered than that. But if we were able to have more of a focus on the subsidy system being balanced so that a chunk of those dollars were going to farmers who are producing food fit for human consumption, that'd be a good investment too. And there has been no appetite by Congress to even touch that because of the corporate capture over government officials, in my opinion. So and then paired with that, another title that would be important on revamping would be the crop insurance title of the federal crop insurance title, the Farm Bill, which I do think there's some value, but currently it incents farmers to grow in a certain way with no conservation compliance to stop contaminants from running into water, for example, taken into impact. It's almost like it's more based on those basic commodities and a yield monitors, and so I just would like to see that it is opened up so that if you're going to get federal crop insurance that is taxpayer subsidized, that you actually have to deploy standards on the land that benefit the overall health of humans
Mm.
and the aquatic life and the things that go with that. But
Hmm.
but to me, those two titles of the Farm Bill should be a nationwide target for advocacy. And neither of those titles are getting reform attention like they have to if this is all to work. And frankly, Congress people are scared to even talk about that in public circles. So that has to change on all sides of the aisle. And well, I'm going to keep talking about those two titles until the moment's right, because things are cyclical, and this will
Yeah.
come back around as the consumer appetite starts to understand through conversations like these how much impact those tweaks in the farm bill could have for reinvigorating the food supply and allowing more farmers to produce foods that once again are fit for human consumption.
Well, keep fighting the good fight, my friend. And there's a future to look forward to yet.
I
Well,
think
Grant,
so.
where can people go to find more about your work and support your mission, and if they want to learn more about regenerative farming?
Yeah, the Regenerate Nebraska project, it has a Facebook page and an Instagram that people follow, so it's easy just to kind of look those up and hop on and follow those platforms. I also have a couple other platforms that we use, including GC Resolve, which is the consulting business that you brought up at the front, which is focused on that shift from this system we're in now into a more environmental and ethical food-based system. The Regenerate Nebraska project is a part of some of the functionality of that business. GC Resolve has a little bit different, like kind of policy, more policy oriented than the Regenerate Nebraska stuff does, which is just kind of really highlighting more of the solution oriented stuff, but it all mixes. And then there is a platform called Nebraska Communities United for those that have big concerns or a more focused concern on the corporate issues. And that's just a Facebook page. The GC Resolve is Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and NCU, Nebraska Communities United, is just Facebook. So those are the three entities that I think you can track along. And if you're really interested, they should get a hold of you and get my email, or we should swap emails, and I can get them on a list, because I do push out information, to people that have certain interests in these spaces as well. So that we're
Hmm.
just more connected. We're more uniform on understanding these, and we can better work on these issues together in our little respective areas, no matter, where you are.
Great, great. Yeah, I can leave your contact information when I post this up if you'd like that.
Yep.
And then finally, what's your final message that you would like to just leave with families who want to just eat cleaner, to support cleaner agriculture, to just make healthier choices?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's hope there, but it's going to take us all, because, my parents were part of the farm crisis in the 80s. They were leaders, and they networked together a bunch of farmers and tried to fight for the fair price and more markets that, would have done a lot of good for us all. But guess what? A lot of the farmers got eradicated, and there's very few numbers of farmers out there compared to that moment that my parents were involved in fighting for the good cause. And so us farmers, the few of us family farmers that are out there that are advocating, willing to share this information, we want to connect more with consumers, because a better connection between farmer advocacy and consumer advocacy where it connects, including transparency and where the food is coming from. Those kind of things are powerful, and that's what's going to allow us. It has to be consumer led this time, and we're here to help now, because we just don't have the numbers, and everyone eats, so everybody has an interest in that. So we should be able to peel off, even if a small percentage, millions and millions of people, like, for this cause. So I think first, consumers are in control of this conversation now, not the farmers, but we're here to help, because we've been asking for new markets for years, but have been, put into a chemical intensive system that is not very profitable. That can all change. It's got to be led by the consumer. Second of all, we talked about it, but know your farmer. Start to do the little things you can to create those relationships, strengthen your food supply. That does help the farmers, businesses be able, to move forward as well. Is it a little bit more expensive? It might be, but you might need to just make some changes, to best respect, like, the value of your body and your brain, which is worth maybe a little bit more if you're in a position to do it. So I think, that's a big part of that too. And I would just also say prioritize food issues and agricultural issues as a top issue. A lot of people, like, are caught up in all these other issues, and you and I like to get together once in a while and, talk about some pretty wild stuff. But at the end of the day, this a transition to agriculture can impact everything and bring solutions in every single part of this, whether you're into environmental, whether you're into socioeconomic equality, whether you're into nutrition, or whether you're a scientist understanding healthy soils, clean water. Man, there's a piece of this for everybody, and it's so layered that that we just really, really need to prop up food, nutrition, and agriculture as the prime issue in this nation right now, because I truly believe that it is. So those are the things that you can do, but your life is in your hands, and we're here to help for anybody who wants to start, making changes. And I love to talk to people on the side and even offer farm tours, for those that want to visit, so that we can just create a closed loop cycle on information, and all start eating healthier together.
Love it. Love it. Well said, my friend. Well, Graham, thanks for coming on today and keep fighting the good fight, my friend.
Always good to see you, my friend.
All right. Take care.
You too.